incredible,
You know,
really.
especially when I was young, my parents were like dirt poor, so we had
Mine
like
too.
canned vegetables.
Yep, that's what we had. My mom would make liver. We had the powdered milk. Like
We
I
did not
can't
have
even,
to do the powdered milk.
I never
All right.
even look at it.
Hello, everybody. We're getting ready to start. We're going to go ahead.
The welfare cheese is another one.
We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about listing contracts as well as the agency disclosure form. So we're going to just dive right in. It should be pretty short and sweet. Again, this is more so kind of geared toward people that maybe are a little bit newer or kind of want a little bit of a refresher. If this is something you do regularly, you might take one or two things away. But let's just dive right in. So let's talk about the actual agency form, the real estate agent relationships and transaction disclosure form. So I've got a couple folks in the room here I'm going to ask a couple questions of, and for those of you watching, you can just kind of benefit from the conversation we have. So when we look at this form that talks about agency, is this an agreement? Is this some sort of a contract that we sign between clients and us as a real estate agent?
Disclosure.
Great answer. This is not an agreement by any means. It is simply a disclosure. So a lot of times, especially if we're early on in the relationship with a potential client, and the good state of Minnesota wants us to slap this in front of them almost immediately, which can sometimes freak people out. Oftentimes what I will do is I will just simply say, hey, you know what? The state of Minnesota requires that I go over this form with you. This is just a disclosure. It's not an agreement by any means. And quite frankly, to be honest, you do not have to sign it. But if you do sign it, it says I went over this form with you. So I have found that when you explain it that way, it disarms, you bring up the form in general. Usually I'll wait till I've built up a little bit of rapport with them first before I just throw this form on the table. But that's how I'll explain it, just to make it a little bit easier to digest. So again, the state of Minnesota requires that I go over this form with you. It's not an agreement by any means. It's simply a disclosure. And I say to them, what Minnesota wants me to disclose to you is the fact that as your agent, I owe you a few things. I owe you loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, reasonable care, and accounting. And I will actually take my pen and I'll circle that section when I'm going over the form with them. And I usually say something really corny like, I owe you loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, reasonable care, and accounting. And I promise with me you get all that and more. And they kind of laugh a little bit. And then I'll circle the notice on the very bottom of the form. And I'll say, I also have to make you aware of this website that you can visit to see if there are any registered sex offenders that might be located near any of the properties that you're interested in, okay? So I've kind of covered my bases. And the reason why I circle all these things is so that if this form is ever reviewed, you can come back and say, I even brought these things specifically to their attention or to your attention if for whatever reason it ever becomes a point of discussion again. So to be honest with you, I go over the form at a very high level. And really, because I'm about ready to talk to them about representing them as a buyer or a seller, I kind of skip straight to what I owe them, what my fiduciary duty is to them. And then I'll get into dual agency and some of the other things as we're talking about contracts and representation and things like that. So any questions on that? It's really short and sweet. And then you just, they sign date pretty easily. And again, I just remind them when they initial at the bottom of the form, it's just saying I made them aware of that website that they can visit. Okay.
Sometimes we'll say too, Zach, you can tell me down, but I sometimes say, they were like, why do I have to initial this? I say, because essentially what we're saying is it's your responsibility to check this out, not my responsibility to check it out and tell you where the predators are. If that's something you're aware of, and here's the website.
Exactly.
So it's just putting responsibility on them.
Exactly. It's just a way to indicate I informed you of that website, and then should you desire to actually utilize that website, that's completely up to you. Yep. Great. Thanks for adding that. So let's move into the actual listing contract. So there's a couple of listing contracts out there. We've got the exclusive right to sell, and what's the other one? Non-exclusive. And are we ever really going to use non-exclusive? Hopefully not. Like, there might be some good reasons, but like almost 99.9% of the time, and I'm always going to recommend you go straight for the exclusive right to represent, because otherwise you're taking a little bit of a risk in taking a listing, investing time and money, and potentially not getting compensated. So we're going to go over the exclusive right to list, dated, of course. It's going to be the property address, the legal description, and last time we talked about where are some places you can find the legal description of a property. Go to the county websites. That's an easy place to find it. If you need to, sometimes you can contact the title company if you're having trouble digging it up. What's another key phrase we could sometimes put in there that just kind of, it would be a lazy person's way or my way of doing it? Right, something that says something like to conform to govern, okay? Seller is, we're gonna put in the seller's name, and then the broker. Now, where it says broker is that the agent's name, or what goes right there? That would be the name of
Leave
the,
that out
that,
there.
yeah, that would be Keller Williams Premier Realty. So it's not your name, and sometimes that can be confusing, especially if it's one of the first times you're doing this form, but broker is Keller Williams Premier Realty. And the seller would be the names of the people actually selling the property. Now, let's get into, let's throw a scenario out there. So obviously, if let's say you're meeting with a husband and wife, and it says seller is. So if I'm meeting with Mr. and Mrs. Smith, whose names am I gonna put in there for seller?
Whatever's on the title.
Mr. and Mrs. Smith typically, right? But let's say, for example, I've had a conversation, I did a pre-qual, and Mrs. Smith says, hey, I'd love to come out and have you list our property, but Mr. Smith is traveling, and he can't be here, but we're in agreement, and we already know that we want to hire you. Can I go there, and can I list that property with just her signature?
Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And here's the caveat, because most people say, well, absolutely not, in order to sell the property, both their signatures. That's true on the purchase agreement, and that's true when it comes to closing documents. But just to list the property, I only need the signature of one party that can go ahead and sell that property. Now, is it in my best interest to make sure all people that have an interest in that property are on the same page about selling it? Absolutely, because if I get the signature of just one, and I don't know the whole story, let's say sometimes this happens with families when somebody passes away. Let's say somebody owned the property, they pass away, and it goes to 4 siblings. One sibling reaches out to you. They don't tell you the whole story. You just think they have a property to sell. You list it, you get a purchase agreement. The title company starts digging stuff up and like, hey, we need 3 other signatures on this sucker. Well, then you start reaching out for these other signatures and you find out nobody else is on board with selling the property. That sucker's not gonna close, right? So it behooves you to know who can sell or who needs to be on the paperwork to sell. And if everybody's on the same page, sometimes you just need the signature of 1 or 2 to actually get it moving forward. But then on the PA and the closing docs, you need everybody to sign. So that's just a good trick, so that if only one of the couple is around, you can still sign it and get it listed. You don't necessarily have to wait. And to be honest with you, with electronic signatures nowadays, I mean, it's pretty easy. Even if you could get a wet signature from one spouse and then have the other one electronically signed if you really wanted to have both on there. Contract starts on blank and ends on blank. What terms are, what's the length of the contracts you guys are typically doing right now?
6 months to a year.
Okay, 6 months to a
It's
year.
their choice. Yeah.
Right, I typically will pre-fill it out and I'll fill it out for a year. That's just kind of what I do. 6 months is probably 6 months or 12 months are probably like the 2 most common things that people will throw in, right? That's fairly easy. But I will tell you what I do when, during the course of conversation, especially if the term becomes a little bit of a talking point, I'll say, here's the deal, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. If at any point in time you become unsatisfied with me and you want to fire me, no problem. No questions asked, we'll sign a cancellation, done deal, right? And I say this with buyers as well, because I always tell them, here's the deal, at the end of the day, you no longer want to work with me. I don't want to force you to work with me because that's just awkward for everybody. And I've talked with agents before who have kept sellers in contracts, and I've never heard a good story or a good outcome. Okay, no judgment if you do that. There might be several reasons to do that, but I'm telling you, I just tell them, both sellers and buyers up front, hey, at the end of the day, if you want to cancel, no problem. Just let me know.
We even write that into our buyer reps and our
Sure.
listing contracts and the other.
Right.
Excluded.
And the added benefit, it makes it a little bit easier for them to commit to you.
But
Right.
it goes both ways. It says if either party chooses to terminate this agreement, so it gives me the option if they're just the most difficult people I've ever worked with.
Sure.
So both of us have that option to
Right.
get out.
That's good. That's good, like you said, for both ways. And for me, I have found that it really just takes out any anxiety about signing a lengthy contract when I tell them, hey, if you want to, and I mean it, if you want to cancel, let's cancel, because I don't want to play that game of every week or every day having some upset person constantly calling me or emailing me just stupid stuff. Hey, if you want to be done, great. Let's be done. Oh, by the way, maybe I can still recommend another agent to come in afterward and still get a referral fee. Just not long ago, I had a listing of a friend of mine who put it on the market, and it was like he would maybe be able to sell, but if we didn't get anything, he would have to short sale. And I just don't do short sales because I know what they are, but I would be lying if I said I'm probably the most confident guy to do the listing. So we had it listed, we had an offer, and then we found out there were some issues with the home and all that, and at the end of the day, they couldn't afford to sell. So I reached out to another Keller Williams agent who specialized in short sales, and he took on the listing for a referral, right? So we can get creative if we need to pass off a listing for some reason, right? Anyway, that's beside the point. So this contract may be canceled by written and mutual agreement of the parties. Okay, got it. Seller offers a property for sale for the price of blank. And then what do you usually fill in for terms?
So previously, we would say in writing, and Bruce told me that we can't do that. That's where you have to put cash,
Mhm.
FHA,
I usually put cash or new financing.
or what?
New financing or cash. That's usually what I put.
What do you mean by new financing? Like opening a new mortgage?
Yep, a new,
That's
like,
all.
as opposed to like assuming a loan.
I see.
So basically, or you could just put financing and or cash, right? You know what I mean? It's pretty easy. What did you guys have put in there before?
We would just put in writing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I usually do cash conventional. And then, I mean, then you have a pretty good idea. If it's something that'll go FHA, DVA, then I'll add those.
Mhm.
And if it's something that I know won't, I leave them off.
Right.
Because I check that. When I look at someone else's listing, if they
Right.
just say cash conventional,
Yeah.
I'll call and say, do you know that this won't pass FHA? And a lot of times they just don't know how to fill it out.
It
Other
would-
times they're like, it
Well,
won't
but
because.
where does that typically show up though? On Flex, right?
Got it.
Mhm.
And in your input form. So here, just to keep it consistent, I usually put new financing or cash. And then on that MLS entry form is where I indicate what type of financing is either allowable or I think will actually cut the mustard. Awesome. So listing, huge language right here. This is really explain to the seller that they're giving you permission to do certain things. You can market the property, that we have co-op agreements with other agencies in town that can show the property, that can hang a lockbox. Some of this might be in some of the other language on the agreement, but that's kind of the gist of some of the boilerplate language in here. IDX website, yep, it's going to be pushed out to a bunch of websites. Okay, what are we checking when it comes to our options to be listed on the internet? What are you guys doing?
Are you yes, 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 no?
Okay, so yes to option one,
Yep.
which is the,
Can it be on the
it's
internet?
on the internet. Option two,
Can you list the address?
can we have the address out there? Absolutely. Number three, do we want an automated valuation
No.
potentially on this sucker?
I
Yes or
usually
no?
put no.
No.
Some people say yes, some people say no. Number four, do we want comments or reviews by other people? Yes or no?
No.
Okay. So, that's to each their own. If you want to have, the first two options almost always are checked yes, right? That just doesn't make sense not to if you're trying to publicly maximize the exposure of the property. Here's what I'll say about the automated evaluations and comments. My gut, my knee-jerk reaction was to check no, and I think I did for a long time. I think now we're checking yes for option 3 and 4, because what we found out is if we checked no to those, it wasn't popular. It meant the listing wasn't showing up on some websites, right? Some websites are like, hey, if you're not going to allow for an automated valuation or comments, then we're not going to put your property on our website, right? So just something to think about, but to each
Do
their
you
own.
know which sites they were?
Not off the top of my head. But if you were going to check no on any of them, option 3 and 4 would be pretty good ones to do so if you want to go that route. Just know there might be a little bit of a trade-off there. All right, so let's move on to, okay, is it listed for lease as well? So ideally, if you're listing a property for sale, what do you typically want to see checked here?
Is not.
Yeah, typically if it's not, if you're just trying to sell a property, typically you're going to want to have it not currently listed for lease, and that they may not also list it for lease during the actual period of time when you're trying to sell it. Because if they do, or if it is, it can get kind of sticky, and then it just becomes a nightmare sometimes. Now, I have done this before though, where there's been a couple of investors I've worked with where we've listed it for sale and for lease at the same time. It's definitely doable. It's a lot easier when you're the same agent because you can control both aspects of it. But if you have it listed for sale and the owner themselves or through a management company is also trying to lease it, it can just be super confusing, and you never really know what the true status of the home is when you're marketing it. Because if somebody calls you to buy it, you're like, well, let me check to see if it's been leased out in the meantime. Then all of a sudden that kind of changes the terms of the deal, because now there's a lease involved that they have to be aware of. Seller's obligation. This one's pretty important, and we need to spend some time talking with our sellers about this if we're not during our listing appointments. Basically, if you get any notification from the city, from the county, from the state, any governing authority regarding your property or assessments or pending assessments or associations, etc., they need to notify you immediately, because that can have a pretty good impact, or it can have a lot of implications for the sale of the property, right? So you just really need to explain to them, hey, if you get anything from the mail about your house, just let me know about it, right? Because that's something that you're going to want to know. Otherwise, it can come back to bite you. Okay, access to the property. This is what it talks about, lock boxes. All the people that are going to need to come and go during the sale of the property. So here, instead of using this as a very boring, I'm going to go through all this language with you, just convert this section, this part of from lines 86 to 105, convert this part of your conversation to the next steps. Hey, once we have your home listed and it's sold, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a home inspection that's going to occur. There's going to be an appraiser that comes out to the property. In order for them to access the home, and in order for people to access your home for showings, I'm going to put a lockbox on your front door. This is how that works. So really, you can, instead of taking this and just talking about a form and making it super boring, just explain to them what they can expect and what the next steps are to come in the process. And that might even be part of your listing presentation. So you could say, hey, I'm going to go over these lines with you in just a minute, or I went over these lines with you during the listing presentation, right? I'm a big fan of hitting the high points of forms. Then I'll leave them with a copy and say, upon further review, if you have questions, let me know. Broker's compensation. Seller agrees to pay a broker a retainer fee of blank. I don't know about you, I'm usually putting a big fat zero in there. Okay, and usually what I tell them, and this was maybe funnier before recent events, I would do this with buyers too, is I would say, I don't charge a retainer fee. I'm not looking to become Donald Trump. And usually people would laugh. I don't know if I'm going to keep using that joke or not, just because who knows. But I just say, hey, no, I don't charge a retainer fee. I'm not looking to, make any money above and beyond what I'm going to when I actually get your home sold. Sellers shall pay as broker's compensation. We're typically seeing what right here? 6% or more, typically, or blank, whichever is greater. Usually line 111, we're putting another what here? Usually another zero, right? We're just saying, hey, we're going to get paid the percentage, right? Line 113, other, usually is a big X or just left blank, right? Not applicable.
So 113, so if I agree with the seller that if I bring the buyer, I'll knock it down to 5.5, or I have some kind of a
variable rate comp.
Yeah, so that's where it would go, right?
Yeah, you can put it in there. That could be a place to put that. Or you might want to say, if I also bring the buyer to this, we'll do a variable rate compensation. We'll drop it to whatever. Or if you list your home with me and you buy with me, meaning you sign the buyer representation contract right now, maybe I'll do it for 5.5 or 5. Right? That would be a good spot to add that. And I would, when you take the listing, don't just have that conversation and not have them commit to it, because that'll burn you all day long, especially if they end up going new construction. Put that in there and have a buyer rep contract with you and make them sign it at the time of the listing. I tell you, there's no better feeling than walking out of a listing appointment, both a signed listing contract and a buyer rep contract signed. That's 2 for 1 special, baby. Do that all day long. Okay, and here's what I tell you. I won't enter into those conversations. I won't offer that up unless I have to, to go back and forth a little bit. But I can't remember the last time I've done that. Well, I can. It was when I was working with investors and we were doing multiple properties. Okay, good discussion. Thank you for that. All right, so this is a biggie. On line 122, and that blank right there, what are you guys typically putting?
180.
180 days, so 6 months?
So I put 30, but I go, the reality is I am not going to keep track of every single person who came through your house and track them down after this contract is expired, because the reality is we're going to sell your house before then. And the other reality is I don't care to be everyone's keeper. So
I put a 0.
Well,
that's what I do.
I just think, I always just go, this in my world is ridiculous, but.
Well, I agree. So I would say on this one, it's to each their own. Obviously, your broker is going to tell you in your best interest, putting 180 days there. It's going to be in your best interest as an agent and offer you the most protection. I, much like you, Carrie, realistically, I just say I put a 0.
Right.
I'm not, here's the deal. I'm not going to be able to keep track of it if we cancel or it doesn't sell. I've already stopped paying attention to that property. I've moved on, right? What I will say though is if somebody strikes me as a little bit shysty, right, I might put something in there and kind of explain to them, how that works. But honestly, I've determined it's not worth my time, effort, or money to try to invoke this clause in an agreement, right? But unless I'm gonna list like a multi-million-dollar property, then I might go ahead and put something in there. But really, honestly, I really don't worry about it too much.
Although I don't track it and I don't hand them over a list, you know.
Right.
If it's expired, I use the opportunity to explain to them that you may be approached by someone, like I'm not accusing them of being shysty, but
Right.
you may be approached by someone who says, hey,
Who is shysty?
we'll wait until, you know, you're done with this realtor and then
Right.
I'll buy the house. You don't have to pay the realtor. I'll get a better deal and they'll try to cut me out of
Right.
after I pay for marketing, et cetera. And then people go, oh yeah, that would be really crappy. Yeah, so that's why this is here. That's
Right.
what I tell people.
Right. And I think that's good. And I think, so what I think about, okay, even if they agree to this, what has to happen next? If I want to get money from them, what am I going to have to do? I'm probably going to have to sue them. And I think to myself, am I realistically going to sue somebody over $5-6 grand? Probably not, right? But that being said, if you put that in there and you explain it to them, well, at least maybe you now prevented them from doing something like that, right? So, like I said here, to each their own. Having that conversation is good, but really how you fill that out, I think, is dependent upon how you run your individual business and what you think you realistically would do. Okay. Next page, property address is going on that bad boy. Let's skip right down to title stuff. So typically, what are we doing on line 148 or line 149?
Asking them what they want.
I should ask you, what's typically getting filled out?
Top 48.
They're typically initially in line 148, right? Because most buyers, sellers, they have no idea what a title company is. Or even if they know what they do, it's not like they know one top of mind, I want to go with this company because I've been doing a lot of research for years and I know what title company I want to use, right?
I use that point right there to say, is there a title company or a lawyer that you would like to use? And I just write it in at the end. So like I'll do RT for Rochester Title, but that gives them the opportunity to say if there is one and I've got it jotted down somewhere.
Right.
And if I said, if you don't know one from the other, I can certainly recommend a few.
Right.
But that's where I have that conversation.
Perfect.
Establish that.
And I just tell folks, typically, people really don't know of a good title company, that sort of thing. If it's something you'd like me to take care of, you would initial by line 148. If you do have a title company in mind, you do 149. And if you want to go ahead and coordinate all that fun stuff. So almost always line 148, right? Which is kind of nice because that gives you also an opportunity, if you're taking great care of your clients and you know of awesome title companies, to one, use somebody who you know is reliable, that has a track record of doing a good job, and just can strengthen another business relationship for you.
Well, who knows how to deal with all the paperwork? I mean,
Right.
all the amendments and stuff. I'm like, this is part of my job. This is why you hire me, 148.
Right, exactly. I hear you. If anybody sometimes muddies this up a little bit, it's the lender, because the lender tries to funnel them to a different title company. Nothing that gets past lenders.
No, but
They're
absolutely.
shiesty.
Yeah.
But they're, and it is,
We're
the
joking.
lenders have way more
Yes.
interaction with the title companies.
Right.
And so there are times they know like, okay, this doesn't get done, or they're the black hole of email, or they're the like,
Yeah.
do you mind if we close, a lender will say that to your client, like,
Well,
let's go here. Or, did you know the one you chose is more expensive than,
Right.
they'll say that too, because they're going through all the dollars with them.
they are, which is why you want to have, hopefully you have a good working relationship with the lender or lenders that you're using on a regular basis. And also, when we send over the full executed purchase agreement, we'll send it to the title company and we will copy the lender on it. So they're made aware of the fact that we've already connected that dot with the title company. In that way, because sometimes wires will get crossed if the lender doesn't know the package has been sent to a title company already. They might just go ahead and do that. And now the buyer and you guys are a little bit confused because you've got two different title companies involved for the buyer and the seller when you just want the one. So let me ask you this. Do title companies care about business that comes from sellers, people selling properties?
Do they care?
Do they care about it really?
What do you mean care?
Do they make money?
Oh, all they get is their title.
Yeah, title company wants your buy business. Title company wants your buyer's buy side business because when they do the buy side business, what do they provide for a fee? Title insurance policy. That's where they're making their money. So on the sell side, their margin is very, very small, right? And if anybody's getting that fee, it's the closer. It's not necessarily the title company, right? So really, it's the buy side business they're after, and that's why sometimes the lenders, are also very interested in that because they know that's where the money is. So it's kind of interesting to keep in mind when you're working with title companies and stuff, to know from what perspective. Now, when you're talking with buyers or sellers, and they're thinking about, and this is probably more relevant for buyers, and they're thinking about a title company versus an attorney, what kind of conversation do you have? With an attorney, so with a title company, you can buy an insurance policy, a title insurance policy, right? With an attorney, what do you get? A title of blank. Opinion, right? It's the attorney's opinion. Hey, my opinion is this title looks pretty clear. Well, if an issue is discovered later, what can you go back to that attorney and do? Just swear at him, pretty much. He's like, hey man, it was my opinion. My opinion is my opinion. Whereas with a title company, if you have an insurance policy in place, you can invoke that insurance policy if it's not any of the exclusions. And that policy should take care of you and make it right. So there's a huge, huge difference when clients are using attorneys versus title companies, because it's opinion versus an insurance policy. Huge, huge difference.
So can I ask a clarifying question about
Yep.
that? So at a title company, they ask, do you want title insurance?
Yes.
Is that question not asked at an attorney? They cannot offer that?
So I would probably say it's going to depend upon your attorneys, and if they do, maybe they partner with the title company to provide that policy. And a lot of your lenders are going to require some sort of title insurance policy, right? So yeah, for them, for the lender, right? So that's why having those conversations is important, and letting your buyers know, like, I don't feel I'm doing them justice if I don't explain to them the difference between an opinion or an insurance policy. Up in the cities, I've never had an attorney do a closing, but I've done some stuff in rural Minnesota, and every once in a while some attorneys come into play, which is fine. I got nothing against them. I just really want to make sure my clients understand there's a huge difference between an insurance policy and an opinion. Okay, good discussion. Additional costs. Seller acknowledges it might be required, certain closing costs, etc. is what it is. It's all negotiable. This one's kind of important when we're having a conversation with our sellers, asking them if they're a U.S. citizen or not. This has always kind of been in our paperwork, and I feel it's, unless you know the details behind it, it's kind of weird that we ask if they're a U.S. citizen or not. What's that really matter? Well, it has everything to do with something called FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. Basically, if you're not a U.S. citizen and you own property here and you sell it, well, your tax implications are very, very different, if you're not a U.S. citizen. And what happens sometimes is somebody who's not a U.S. citizen will sell a property and leave the country, or they'll be out of the country when they sell the property. And if the appropriate tax is not collected at that time, that tax burden passes to who? Passes to the buyer, the person that just bought the property. So even though they didn't benefit from the let's call it profit of the sale of the home, if the U.S. government doesn't collect their taxes from the seller, they're going to get it from somebody. They're going to come back to the buyer for it. So what's important for us to know is, are you a U.S. citizen or not? If they check is not, well then, hey, we're going to have to maybe get some accountants involved to review this to see if there's any tax implications, and if you're representing the buyer, to make sure that the seller pays those taxes so that your clients don't assume them.
So a non-resident alien is different than a resident alien. So you can be a resident alien and not be a citizen.
Right.
Because that's me. So then I would still say is not a foreign person.
Exactly. We would have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
Yep. I just throw out there U.S. citizen because I think it sounds a little bit more kosher than, are you a foreign person? You know what I mean?
It just says, what's your status?
Right.
If I think they're not a citizen, I say, what's your status?
Exactly.
What's your immigration status?
And then you can have a conversation about how that box should be checked out.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And really, this isn't a showstopper. It's just raising the hand, saying, hey, this is something that's going to have to be discussed once we have an offer that's accepted, so that we make sure that all the tax stuff gets worked out appropriately. This has also been added to the last page of the purchase agreement as well.
So if they go, yeah, I'm not, I could do it, I am not a foreign, or I am a foreign person, and they go, well, how much is that gonna affect this purchase? No idea. just
Right.
refer them to
I'd say
the
that's a-
closing company or
Right,
accountant?
that's a great question. I highly recommend, we get you in touch with an accountant to figure out what implications that might have for the sale of your property.
So would the title company not be able to know that? Or the mortgage, I mean, who would,
An accountant, somebody
They
that
would have to be-
specializes in tax.
But if you check is, the title company has to withhold, so they must have some idea what to withhold, don't they?
So if you check so we treat home ownership and the money you make differently if it's a personal residence versus an investment, et cetera. So the title company is going to kind of know that. But when it comes to whether or not you're a U.S. citizen or a foreign person and the tax implications, the title company, and here's why this is being raised as an issue, title companies were not catching it or they didn't know what to do about it. So what you need to do is find an accountant or a CPA, a tax person who specializes in this and knows exactly what should happen and when.
so is that our responsibility then to, I mean, are we the ones who would call the accountant and say, I've got the sale going down, and then we put them in touch with the title company? I feel like we're kind of the middle person in that.
Yeah, that's probably.
Is
what
that
we
really
would do.
how it would go down?
Yeah, I'd probably connect them. I'd probably get an email address.
Yeah.
Shoot an email address to my client with, hey, this is a person that might be a good person to reach out to regarding this, and then bring the title company in the loop on it as well.
So would it be a good question too, like title companies sometimes have lawyers working for them?
Mhm.
And they might also have an account, correct?
Right, yeah,
So we
maybe
could
reach-
just say, do you have someone who can handle this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You could ask the title company, hey, just to let you know, this
Yeah.
could be a potential FERPA issue. Do you guys feel comfortable handling this? Do you have a go-to person?
Yeah.
You know, I'll just put the ball in your court.
I like that better, or
Yeah.
like.
Right.
handling it that way.
Whichever you prefer. It's just really knowing whether or not it's going to be a potential issue and having a game plan for it versus a surprise at or after closing in which your buyer now is inheriting a huge tax issue. Agency. Okay, here we'll talk a little bit about dual agency. Obviously, we want them to, I shouldn't say we want them to, but we know it's in their best interest likely to agree to dual agency because that's going to mean they've got way more potential buyers for their property than if they don't, right? So usually I just keep it pretty simple. I said, dual agency means that if somebody else from my same company has a buyer for the property and they bring the buyer and I'm the listing agent, because the company's on both sides of the deal, that's dual agency. Or if I also found a buyer and brought them to the transaction, that means it's dual agency, meaning that I'm technically on both sides of the company, or the company, Keller Williams, is on both sides of the transaction. And if we get into the weeds even more on it, I'll say, well, here's the deal. If you don't agree to dual agency, that means nobody else from my office can bring a buyer to your home. We've got over 100 agents, right? So if we want to maximize the chances of selling your property for top dollar, dual agency is actually a good thing. That's usually in the discussion.
So you don't talk about it limits your representation.
If we want to get into the weeds and stuff on it, here's what I will say. If we got an offer that was dual agency, I would dive into that in more detail. That almost never happens, right?
So that happened a lot before.
Right, I'm sure.
And
it
so
did.
we would say that dual agency has two parts to it. One, it limits your representation in that I can't negotiate for you to the detriment of the other person involved. So I said, well, that sounds like, well, what am I doing then? I said, what it does is creates the most fair transaction that you're going to get. So nobody is screwing the other person over, essentially.
And
Is
usually,
there a different way to say that or a better way to say that?
well, just typically, I just try to give them the high points, and then if we get into a situation where we have an offer in which it's potentially dual agency, then I'll dive into the conversation with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but would they not, is that, you would want to know that on the front end?
Because if you read this, it says they're open to a dual agency transaction, right? It doesn't say they're agreeing to one. It's like, hey, we're kind of open to one, because when they actually get a purchase agreement and I have to explain to them whether it says dual agent or not, at that point I'll say, now this is, if we're going to enter into a dual agency transaction, these are the things you need to understand about it. Because here's the deal. You and I both know I can explain this now, but if we get an offer that's dual agency, I'm going to have to re-explain it anyway. And at that point in time, it's actually pertinent and really relevant. So you can do whatever you want. I'm just telling you what I do.
Yeah.
I'll explain to them, the high points, the concept of it. We'll check it. And then if we find ourselves in a dual agency situation, then at that point, we're really going to go in the weeds on it, especially if they have some more questions.
Well, I agree. They need to know. I think most people out in the world think dual agency means just me or just you.
Mhm.
Like, oh, you mean where you get both sides. No, dual agency is all of Keller Williams, so. Because some people kind of go, well, yeah, I don't want you to have the buyer. Well, that means everyone at
Can you
Keller Williams, and then, yeah.
Can you explain that part?
Right. And then they're kind of like, oh, well, yeah, you don't want over 100 agents not being able to sell your house, so.
So it says, however, if the seller should decide not to agree to possible dual agency, and the seller wants a broker to represent the seller, they may give up the opportunity to sell the property to a buyers represented by the broker. It kind of explains that to them. But yeah. Any other questions on that? It's good. I can tell you have some more.
No, I think there's just 18 ways to navigate that.
Yeah.
That's all.
And I mean, I personally think I'm trying to be careful what I say because it's being recorded. But dual agency, I think, kind of gets blown out of proportion sometimes, especially when you have two different agents from the same company. It's pretty easy for that to be a normal transaction. You're still going to negotiate, right? So it's kind of like, you know, really the only sticky situation is if you're representing both the buyer and the seller. But I have to explain to people, you know, one added benefit to that is we now have total control over the transaction. If something's going wrong, we're going to know about it immediately. Nobody can sugarcoat it or hide it, etc. And if we have more control over that transaction, chances are it's going to go much smoother for you because we're going to be well informed. Previous agency relationships, indemnification, fair housing, additional note. Okay, this is stuff I really don't spend too much time on, to be honest with you. You know, electronic signatures. I explained to them, hey, you know, we might be doing this in person, signing, you know, wet signatures this time, but moving forward, a lot of our communication and signatures are going to be done by electronic. Where it says 217, that other space is another space where you can put variable rate comp, agent bonuses, or if you sign with me for a buyer rep, we'll also, you know, maybe do something different with our commission. So, any questions? I don't really collect a bunch of extra data on these folks either, like all their addresses and email addresses. Have them sign this. Any questions? That's just one method. All right, well, that's all I've got. Thanks very much for coming. Oh, they're going to sell theirs, sign there as well. Obviously, there's two of them. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much.